Yes.
I think more directly
Worth repeating.
directly toward the German case to be a little bit more critical of this idea that the churches had sort of inherently resisted the Nazis, sort of interpreting the entire history of Christianity under National Socialism through the lens of, a figure like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I
Right.
think can lead us to have a little bit more humility, perhaps, about the role of the church in sort of resisting totalitarian movements in the 20th century, and therefore be a little bit more kind of thoughtful about the role of sort of religious organizations in our own time. I mean, I think another point that I'm trying to make more broadly in the book is this sort of critical look at kind of post-war democracy and looking at some of its exclusionary aspects as well, part of which were sort of introduced by religious organizations, and seeing how democracy is kind of not simply something that this sort of set of institutional features that was instituted in 1945 and was perfect, but rather a kind of ongoing project that constantly has to be remade. And maybe that's something that can give us a little bit of hope when we're seeing sort of challenges to democracy today. A reminder that it's not, simply one fixed thing, but rather a form of government and of sort of social life that's always in motion and always in progress, and that we have a responsibility for.
Well, hey there, guys. Welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable. I am your host here, Josh Burtram, also the co-host on the Faithful Politics podcast. Happens here on the same channel. So here on the Faith Roundtable, we talk about issues in Christianity, issues pertaining to American Christianity, focusing explicitly on that, trends in the faith and all of that. Whereas on the Faithful Politics podcast, we focus on the intersection of politics and faith, and that happens here, but we've more explicitly focused on what's going on in the faith, talking to leaders, scholars, thought leaders, people like that. And I'm before I jump into that though, a couple things. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff that keeps this stuff going. We want to get you great content that you can share, that's going to be stimulating for your thoughts and mind and heart. And so make sure that you're checking it out and that you're sharing. And also, we have a Patreon. Go check that out. It's patreon.com, I think /Faithful Politics. But if you go to patreon.com, look it up, you'll find us. We're going to be putting stuff out there, so make sure you join that growing community. We want you to be a part of it. Today, though, I have the pleasure of interviewing on our show Brandon Bloch, Dr. Brandon Bloch. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research focuses on modern European history, political theology, and human rights, with particular attention to the relationship between Christianity, nationalism, and democracy in the 20th century Germany. He's the author of Reinventing Protestant Germany, Religious Nationalists and the Contest for Post-Nazi Democracy, which we will be talking about with him today. And this examines how German Protestants navigated moral responsibility, political reconstruction, and democratic life after World War II. And we are so glad to have you to the show, Brandon. Thanks for coming on to talk about this German church that seems so relevant to us today. It's interesting. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to speak with you.
So a lot of times I have pastors, I have theologians, and yet today I have a scholar of European history on the Faith Roundtable to talk about the German church. And I think it's so fascinating because I love history, and I think we don't look at history enough, and we ignore history to our peril. I think all the lessons that we need to learn today are in history that we could take and learn. I understand technology is different and all of that, but humans are the same. And I think that's the key thing. And so, man, I'm so glad to have you here to talk about this and, to kind of help us kind of level set. Because what I want to do is I want to draw out from the book this understanding of what happened in the German church, especially, of course, like from your book, after the absolute tragedy of Nazism and the way in which I'm sure that ravaged the church. And we know, how did they pick themselves up? And I would love for you to just kind of give your basic thesis for our audience, right? What is the basic thesis of the book, and why'd you write it, so that we can kind of level set?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I appreciate your point about the relevance of history for the present day. I think that's something that, sometimes we forget, but that all historians like to hear. So the basic thesis of the book, I would say, is to some extent, call into question a narrative that the kind of reconstruction of the German church after World War II happens through a kind of straightforward moral reckoning with the Nazi past. And instead, what I want to suggest is that there were quite a few continuities that one can draw from Nazism through the post-war period. So just for those who didn't tune into the podcast, the last time I was on, to sort of recap, right, the book is kind of focused on a generation of both pastors, but also Christian lay people who were born around the early 20th century, begin their careers during the kind of turbulent era of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy in the 90s, participate in the kind of conflict to define the church's role in the Nazi state, and then after 1945 become critical leaders both in the Protestant church and in German politics more broadly. And what I argue specifically is going on after 1945 is that church leaders and politicians associated with the Protestant churches are claiming a kind of moral role as key figures in the reconstruction of post-war Germany, claiming that they have a certain insight in terms of guiding the values or setting the values that should guide Germans in the kind of reconstruction of their society. But many of those people themselves had quite an ambivalent relationship to Nazism, and their post-war politics is based largely on an assertion of having been kind of at the forefront of anti-Nazi resistance. But those narratives that are put forth of anti-Nazi resistance oftentimes contradict what had actually been going on under Nazism. So that's really a kind of key tension that I want to highlight in the book.
I mean, I really love that, and it is a key tension from the book, and I think you're so good in bringing that out. And when we're thinking about Protestant Germany reinventing itself, right, from 1945, of course, people know about World War II, and we talked about this in the other episode on the Faithful Politics podcast, where you came on and talked about this as well. But it's reinventing himself from what? Now, I know that you had said there are some continuities there, but help us understand. Well, let me back up for a second. Like, when I think about this, I think about the first 50 years of the 20th century, and man, that would have been a terrible time in some ways to live.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in Europe, man. I'm looking at what happened, and if you're a Russian peasant at that time, or a Russian, like, part of it'd probably be an absolutely horrific time to live in that first 50 years, just from what I understand of the history. And then and thinking about in Germany, what happened in that first 40 years, right? 45 years. What happened? And you can just get in big blocks from 1900 to 1945, say, that formed the Protestant Germany from which the church had to reinvent itself. What was it reinventing itself from? I'd love for you to go into more depth on what was happening in the actual Protestant church during those 45 tumultuous years.
Yeah, so I think you put that very well, right? That this is a very sort of tumultuous and dramatic time, which makes it so interesting for historians to study. If one looks at Germany in 1900, which is not, that long ago, right? Within living memory, let's say, for our, great-grandparents.
My grandparents were born in 1911.
Yes, yeah. So Germany at that time was a monarchy ruled by the Hohenzollern dynasty, which itself was Protestant, and Germany had a kind of structure of church-state relations really going back to the Reformation, where rather than having what they would term in America as kind of free churches, so essentially churches that function as nonprofit organizations that are kind of independent of the state, instead Germans, even today, can pay a kind of church tax, right? So the churches are subsidized
It's
through the
wild, man.
public tax system. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to a whole system of kind of managing the Protestant Catholic relations, going back to the period of the Reformation and kind of keeping things, in balance. But in Germany, the Hohenzollern dynasty was Protestant. And so actually the Kaiser, so Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the ruler in 1900, was officially the kind of head of this sort of symbolic head of the Prussian Protestant Church, which was the largest Protestant
Really?
church in Germany. So this is
Wow.
where you get this kind of synthesis between the church and in nationalism. And the church was also trying to combat, or what was in some ways in tension with, what was the largest socialist movement in the world at the time. Germany is sort of at the forefront of industrialization, especially in the chemicals and electrical industry, but also in things like
Hmm.
steel production. And you have a sort of socialist movement, which is largely, sort of in tension with the church. And so you have the church trying to somehow figure out ways to kind of bring workers back. And one of the ways of doing that was presenting itself as a sort of patriotic body. So you have this kind of synthesis of the church and nationalism. And this, of course, is really challenged then by, the First World War. And you ask for sort of big blocks. So ultimately we have sort of the war.
Yes.
At the end of the war, there's a revolution. The monarchy is overthrown. A kind of social democratic government comes to power, which at first actually tries to knock the church out of this sort of public status. The church has successfully managed to resist and kind of recoup some of their old privileges in the constitution of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, but still don't have the same degree of cultural authority, right? The monarchy is no longer there. You have a kind of democratic government. You have women's suffrage for the first time. You have the emergence of, all sorts of, modern entertainment. Berlin becomes a center of modernist art, new sort of experiments in cinema and architecture and queer life and all sorts of things. And the churches are trying to navigate that. And at least for
Hmm.
some fairly significant segment of the pastorate that sees itself as kind of out of place in the new society and somewhat sort of disillusioned with democracy. Of course, they also, a lot of church leaders buy into this idea that the democracy sort of represents the kind of the socialist forces that were responsible for Germany's loss in the First World War. Nazism appeals in some sense is a movement that promises to revive more traditional values, and at least, the Nazis claim that they're going to sort of restore the place of the churches in society. Of course, this doesn't really happen, and we talked about this a little bit, last time. There's actually quite a bit of tension between Nazism and the churches, but
Yes.
nevertheless, especially when the Second World War breaks out, the churches continue to argue for kind of national loyalty, and many pastors, even within movements in the church that had been more kind of critical of the regime's somewhat anti-Christian direction, many of those pastors still go on, for instance, to serve as military chaplains or to serve, in the Nazi military. So these sort of intertwinements still remain, even really through the end of the war.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry for the delay. I was thinking about the question because, when you're thinking about World War I, this massive event, and I just had this curiosity when you brought it up, because obviously, right, the two wars had massive consequences and changed the world, right, irreparably.
Mm-hmm.
Changed religion irreparably in Europe as well, coming from this kind of almost pre-World War I, this industrial revolution. We're going to solve all the problems, progress until now we've created essentially this mass industrial way of killing people.
Mm-hmm.
And the slaughter is unimaginable previously, right? Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying? So do you feel like the World War I into World War II, is that essentially one conflict? I know that sounds weird. Is it almost like I'm just curious about this question because I've heard this before and I want to get your take. Is it like a 30 years war kind of thing? Like from Europe, that kind of feel where it's like this conflict that rises into another conflict? Or is it like, how do you see the relationship between those two things and how they affected religion in Germany? You could go broader, but you can stick to Germany or in Europe, maybe widely in Germany specifically. Yeah, because I think that's important to set that context, because those wars, man, it's hard for us to put ourselves in the kind of apocalyptic and cataclysmic context of those wars. I know this is just a very quick
Mhm.
aside, but even thinking about the 1918 Spanish flu that I didn't even know about, that killed 100 million people or something like that.
Mhm.
There's a massive disease right at the end of the war and essentially almost forgotten, quote unquote, in popular memory. And it's like trying to even put ourselves into the trauma of that time is probably difficult. How did that, yeah, I know I put a lot in there, but
Mhm.
essentially, do you think it's kind of like a 30 years war? And then how did that affect German Protestantism moving out of the Second War? What was the state of it essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's a thesis that's been debated and put forward by historians, but I think there's definitely a lot to sort of seeing with the continuities in the era of the world wars, as you say, in terms of this kind of industrialized mass killing, in terms of, the Second World War largely emerges out of conflicts over kind of territorial control, economic power, which are unresolved out of the First War. I mean, one of, major principles of the whole kind of Nazi worldview is that Germany had kind of been stabbed in the back. They had sort of unfairly
Yes.
lost the First World War. They had been unfairly treated. And so you needed basically another war to kind of reset the terms of the global political and economic order in ways that would be more favorable to Germany, which was arguably a lot of the rationale for why the Kaiser, ultimately
Right.
favored getting Germany into the First War as well. So I think there's certainly an argument. I mean, of course, we don't want to discount the real legitimate sort of internationalist efforts at overcoming the conditions that had brought about war. So I think we can also
Right.
see the sort of period between the wars as a time of a new kind of internationalism, a new humanitarianism. There were, efforts at the League of Nations. There was an effort, Kellogg-Briand Pact, to kind of outlaw interstate wars, and actually some of the sort of Nuremberg principles, sort of crimes against peace, actually come out of that period. So you don't want to discount these sort of these real efforts at
Right.
reviving
Right.
internationalism, the peace. But nevertheless, I think there is certainly a continuity. And in terms of religion, yeah, I mean, I think especially the First World War really erodes this kind of belief, as you say, progress, right? In Germany in particular, you had this idea of sort of liberal Protestantism, which was very popular, especially among the more kind of university educated and sort of upper middle class Protestants, which was the idea that, sort of the Protestant faith could go hand in hand with an increasingly kind of rational and liberal society, right? So the idea that you were moving away from sort of mystical and kind of irrational forms of religion that were often, sort of associated with kind of the Catholic Church, going back to sort of Reformation era stereotypes. And the idea that Protestantism could kind of deliver a purer forth of a purer sort of source of faith, this kind of connection between the individual and a personal God, which sort of went along with the growing a kind of individualism in progress that was sort of associated with the industrial age. And that really gets sort of shattered by the First World War. There had been a sort of expectation among a lot of liberal but also more conservative Protestants during the war that sort of God was kind of active in shaping history, that God would come in on the side of Germany, right? This was so there's this sort of alignment between a sort of religious forces and the forces of kind of progress in human history. And that whole sort of way of interpreting history really is shattered, and you get these, new religious currents, most sort of famously in the German context, a theologian like Karl Barth, who is what is probably the
Mm,
most kind of famous,
yes.
one of the sort of biggest Protestant theologians of the 20th century, who basically calls into question whether, sort of scripture can really provide any insight into sort
Yes.
of the forces of human history, and sort of is arguing that God is completely sort of God's will for man is completely unknowable, and we simply have to, return to the first principles of faith, drawing on, Kierkegaard and breaking in these different sort of forms of a kind of more, existential religion. And I think that's really, a reaction to the sense of destruction and chaos, in the idea that, sort of God's will in history really seems much more kind of unknowable after the First World War. And I think you see some of these themes kind of reemerging after the Second World War, though I think with some differences as well. I think in part because of the political situation that the churches have an easier time of sort of asserting a kind of political role in societal reconstruction after the Second World War in Germany in ways that kind of eluded them after the first. I'm happy to sort of build on that as well.
Well, I mean, I just think it's such a fascinating. So it's such a fascinating thing to me because I think context is so important in all of this. And the more that we understand the context, the more we actually humanize the people and villainize them. I think we villainize people from the past, and I understand there are certainly villains, I think, from the past, people that disregarded human life. I think Hitler would be kind of like a villain par excellence for like the 20th century. Maybe put Stalin up there, maybe Pol Pot. I don't know. Some of these people that had very little regard maybe for human life when it got in the way of their plans, right? And so I definitely think that, but we tend to villainize people. And, I watched this, and I think I mentioned this the last time we spoke, but I watched this documentary based on a book called Ordinary Men. And in that documentary, it basically was talking about the Einsatzgruppen and basically kill squads or whatever. I don't remember what it stood for, like special squads or something like that, that went on the Eastern Front in World War II and did perform mass murders of Jewish people and political dissidents. And so when I watched that, you saw that these were people that were heading these Einsatzgruppen, and within them, they were ordinary people. They had PhDs even. Some of them extraordinary people, very well educated, grew up in church. I am quite certain of it. Going to church and maybe people of faith in some way, and yet they're out here doing this, which I think that just exposes to me as an extreme, in the extreme form of kind of the compromise that you are talking about in this book, and almost like looking back, wanting to, because even within the Einsatzgruppen, what did they say? They said, we were following orders, and the orders, that moral logic was the orders that we're following. That's what I did. And that absolved me from all moral accountability in this, essentially. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong. By the way, I'm not at all an expert. And so that's why I like talking to experts, because they say, well, maybe, but then, think about it this way. So I'm just bringing this up to again, create the context for us that these were ordinary people. These were humans living in a context that they didn't necessarily choose and they had to work through. And so you see this kind of like tension right after the war, where they're trying to make sense of everything and they're trying to kind of reinterpret the past. And that's kind of what you're saying. And so this isn't a story of clean repentance leading to clean democracy, right? So what was the repentance? How did that happen? Did they repent? Or, right, help our audience understand what happened, right? That these were kind of ordinary people trying to now reinvent. How did they reinvent it? And how did they try to reinterpret the past? And I don't know if there's anything about the church in Nazi Germany that is relevant to make sure that you're bringing out now. Like, essentially, I'm trying to understand the continuities and discontinuities. What were they as they move forward after 1945?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll say one quick thing on the ordinary men thesis. I would also recommend, your listeners might be interested in a book by Doris Bergen, who is a Holocaust historian at the University of Toronto, on military chaplains in Nazi Germany. And she gets into some of this context and shows how really, anti-communism becomes, I think, a key kind of ideological bridge between Nazism and the church, right? Because you had the military, participating in many cases in atrocities on the Eastern Front. And the chaplains oftentimes would kind of celebrate the German invasion of Ukraine, parts of the Soviet Union, right, in terms of talking about the revival of Christianity, right, even sort of invoking, Jesus, kicking the moneylenders out of the church, right, out of the temple, the sort of anti-Semitic, but actually sort of the parallel was that, in fact, the Germans were encouraging the reopening of churches, right, so religion had been largely suppressed in the Soviet Union, especially during Stalinism from the late, 1920s through 90s. And you had the Germans coming into Ukraine, which had, been taken over by the Soviet Union. And you had churches kind of reopening under German occupation. And then this sort of being celebrated by the military chaplains to sort of show this kind of righteous mission. So I just wanted to point to that as kind of a way that, right, that the church is kind of coming into this scenario.
I want to get to the discontinuities.
Yeah.
But I want to just make sure. So there, I didn't even think about this. There are chaplains in the Nazi, the Wehrmacht,
The Wehrmacht, yeah.
right? That's the war machine. So is that what that means by is that war machine Wehrmacht? Is that
Actually, so interestingly, it's the kind of defense force. Ironically enough, wehren means like to defend, because of course everyone wants to present themselves right there, defending, Western civilization against communism, and so
gotcha?
right, so every offensive army wants to present themselves as a defense force.
So the war machine that got to was that something? And I know we're kind of getting up, but is that something that the enemies gave, or is that something the Nazi Party used to
No,
describe?
I mean the Wehrmacht sort of defense force. I mean that was the name for the military.
Gotcha. And
And
then,
they
but did
had,
they
yes,
call it
they
war machine, or what? How did that term come about?
I think that's probably something that was sort of later,
Just kind of labeled onto it, because I know that
applied.
that's one of the terms that, and maybe it was from Eisenhower when they were about to
Mhm.
cross the channel. He uses Hitler's war machine or something like that, that kind of
Right. I
language, and
think
maybe
that's
that's the origin of it. So,
his.
okay, so that's good. Sorry for that little aside there. But so you have actual clergy
Mhm.
in this army
Yes.
that is at there systematically murdering people. Are they aware of this? Are they seeing it? So it's like, this is mind blowing to me, because they're coming in, they're opening churches. This is revival. And yet at the same time, they're literally having mothers hold their babies so that they can use one bullet to shoot through the baby into the mother and kill them and fall into a mass grave.
I would think, that it is worth making. One doesn't, one wants me to be very careful about this. So there is a distinction between the military on the one hand, and then the SS, which was the paramilitary that was
Right.
sort of
That's
the
true.
Einsatzgruppen. So the
Right.
Einsatzgruppen did not have chaplains, right? They were.
Really?
Yeah, so the Einsatz, I mean, the SS was headed by, Heinrich Himmler, who supported a more kind of like paganist, ideology. But
Really?
having said that, this whole idea that the Wehrmacht was totally like independent of the crimes is also, has been thoroughly debunked, and it's been shown that
Mm.
the Wehrmacht was also, you know, uh, uh, participating, as well, and sort of aware of the crimes that were going on. And certainly, yes, military chaplains stationed in, Ukraine would have been aware of the mass killings, right? And this was sort of downplayed in, sermons, of course. Like, I mean, they ultimately, I think, saw their role as providing, kind of psychological support for young men who had in many cases been. So again, this is another difference. The
Right.
SS is reliant on kind of volunteers and a sort of ideological hardcore. The military relied on conscription, and so they saw themselves, I mean, first of all, they still sort of saw themselves as patriots, right, and having their national duty to serve their country in wartime. And secondly, is having to provide kind of Christian, comfort to the soldiers who were, facing the challenges of war. But that, of course, then entailed, systematically neglecting, downplaying the atrocities that were,
Yes.
occurring at the same time that churches were being reopened. So the moral calculus, I think,
Yeah.
is extremely complex. I'm happy that
Yes.
so you'd also asked about, the post 1945
Yes.
situation. And so then how the church kind of reckons with it. And one of the sort of chapters of the book, which is one of the things I sort of, parts of the book that I wrote first and got me thinking about some of these questions. I look at how the Protestant church, and including sort of famous leaders like Martin Niemöller, who wrote the sort of confession, "Then They Came for Me," and he
Right.
had been imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps for criticizing the regime, and is released by the U.S. Army in May of 1945 and becomes a kind of leader in the post-war church. But Niemöller and even others who had been critical of the Nazis become extremely critical of the Allied measures of sort of war crimes trials and denazification, right? So the Allies
Really?
sort of come in, yes, and they have this whole program. Famously, there's the Nuremberg trials, which is actually a small trial, right? It brings up only 24 Nazi leaders are indicted on charges of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war
Right.
crimes. 21 actually are able to appear before the court. But there's hundreds of other trials in the mid to late 1940s across the occupation zones in Germany. And there's also a denazification program. So anyone who had been any German adults who wanted basically a job in the civil service had to go through this process of kind of reporting their political activities under the Nazis to a kind of tribunal to determine whether they were fit to serve in the post-war civil service. And the church really tries to kind of position itself as representing the interests of the German people by being extremely critical of all of these sort of post-Nazi measures at post-Nazi justice. And the basic argument that they make is one that has to do with kind of secularization, right? So they claim that this entire kind of trajectory that Europe has gone through really from, especially with, like we talked about, industrialization of the early 20th century, through the world wars and this kind of industrialized warfare, through Nazism and totalitarian ideologies, that all that really is a product of kind of the decline of Christianity, the decline of Christian values. So what you really need sort of after the war, they claim, is for the different side, rather than trying this sort of punitive justice that tries to kind of root out like who is responsible for Nazism. They say, well, we're basically all guilty because we all got trapped in this kind of secular world, and so did the Americans as well, right? So really, we should kind of come to this rather sort of coming together around Christian values in a way that's framed as being in opposition to the kind of, what they claim is sort of the punitive approach that the Allies are taking. Now, that's a sort of highly interested and motivated, right? Because, of course, the church itself had its own kind of complicated history under Nazism that it doesn't really want to face up to. But this kind of attack on denazification in the name of kind of ecumenism and Christian values and reconciliation, I think is an important move. And they also have allies within the American Protestant pastorate as well that I think is really significant.
So I mean, we can get into all that. What made German Protestantism such, right? We think of Luther, but he was like hundreds of years, right, before that. What made it such a force for national identity, and even continued to make it a force for national identity? Right? It seems like, right, from what you're saying, this was continuing to be a force of stabilization, a force people look to. I mean, post-World War II, how many people were still officially in the German church? Or the same as before?
So that's a great question. It actually increases because you had people, right, who had sort of left the church.
Right.
Especially during, people who had been like in the SS, let's say, so I mentioned this is the kind of elite, Nazi paramilitary that was really the most responsible for the Holocaust and the other atrocities on the Eastern Front. These people were oftentimes encouraged to unregister from one of the established churches, Protestant or Catholic, and register under this category of Gottgläubig, essentially sort of believing in God, kind of, faithful, but not denominational, not doctrinaire, right? And this was what they were sort of pushing. And then after the war, a lot of these people sort of re-register for the church, right? Precisely because the church is the one that's really, pushing this narrative like against denazification, reconciliation, and so forth. So it also becomes a kind of home for ex-Nazis who are sort of looking to get, like affidavits from their pastor, right, to go to the denazification commission, say, look, so-and-so is a good, Christian. So yes, they might have joined this Nazi organization, but this was really just, they had to, survive economically and blah, blah, blah. And now they've rejoined the church and look, they're a good Christian. So there was a lot of this whitewashing. I mean, I think that, one of the big reasons why they continue to serve as a source of national identity after the war, I mean, they still have to some extent sort of their resources and infrastructure intact, right? So if you look at Germany post-war, there's really, there's no state, right? I mean, not only are the Nazis overthrown, but the entire like state structure is essentially demolished, and the Nazis, that the Allies establish a military government that's sort of overseeing German officials. Political parties have been, all of the political parties had been outlawed and disbanded by the Nazis. Same thing with, trade unions and other kinds of independent organizations. The churches had been, to some extent brought in to line, but still allowed to maintain a kind of independent institutional existence through the Nazi period. So they were a place that actually had still resources and infrastructure. And then I think there's also this piece about international cooperation that I mentioned England as well. So U.S. occupation officials
Yeah, talk a little
often,
bit more about that.
yeah.
This international
hmm
cooperation.
Yeah, so this, the narrative that the churches had been kind of the centers of resistance against Nazi Germany is
Right.
something that becomes popular even in the 1930s and during the war in Britain and the United States as well. There's this, I mean, the World Council of Churches, which your listeners may, probably know about, as sort of international, sort of ecumenical body that consists of mainly sort of Protestant and Orthodox churches throughout the world. It's based in Geneva. That was founded officially in 1948 in Amsterdam, but it had predecessors in the international missionary movement going back to the period between the two world wars. And in the 1930s, a number of leaders in the organization, Western Europeans and Americans in the organization that would become the World Council of Churches. So people like George Bell, who was an Anglican, the Bishop of Chichester, and others had close connections still to their German counterparts that they had developed through these missionary organizations and these kind of international Christian organizations. And so people like, Bishop Bell, who's active in Britain, really sort of popularized this narrative after the Nazis come to power, right? That the Nazi regime is this kind of, they marginalize the anti-Semitism, argue that the Nazi regime is primarily this anti-Christian regime and the Christian churches are resisting. United States, there's a number of prominent political figures that are involved with these types of movements. So John Foster Dulles, who is well known as the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. His brother Allen Dulles was was the head of the CIA during the 1950s. Both of them were active in, along with other important figures in American society, in the Federal Council of Churches, which was this sort of Protestant organization in the 30s and 40s, right, that also has connections to its German counterparts, publicizes the narrative of resistance. Martin Niemöller, who I mentioned, appears on the cover of Time magazine in 1940, so before America joins the war, but is a kind of symbol of,
Right.
he's in a concentration camp. Christians are resisting the Nazis. So these ideas are circulating, in America and in Britain as well. And then sort of, after the war, this then, helps the churches kind of make the claim that they are, had resisted the Nazis and therefore kind of deserve to have this status and kind of leading post-war Germany, even as they're opposing these, what they see as the kind of punitive measures of post-Nazi justice, right? And you have, I mean, this is also controversial, though, in the United States. You have people within the, the Truman administration and Christians in the U.S. who also argue that the approach to denazification was kind of too punitive and needs to be shifted.
So, okay, I have so many questions.
Yeah.
It's all right. So this myth of resistance, okay, again, you're explaining how that came about, especially internationally. Was this something that was like, this is just a myth that genuinely just emerged from the psychology of the war, or was there a deception behind it in your sense? Like, were there certain people that are trying to push this myth deceptively, knowing it wasn't real? Or was it, hey, this is kind of it's almost like the collective conscious of, post-World War I, that everyone might, agree the Treaty of Versailles. That's not a very good analogy. I'm just trying to think of, was it an emergent property, or was it one that you feel like was deliberately sent, like maybe like the stab, like, was it like the stab in the back myth deliberately sent out as propaganda? Or was it more of an emergent property of trying to make sense of how Christianity and Nazism could have existed at the same time?
Yeah, so I would say that it's more of the second. I mean, I don't see a lot of evidence that people like, Bishop Bell or, John Foster Dulles or others sort of, actively saw themselves as propagating a myth. I think rather one has to kind of look at the sort of intellectual and political presumptions that people sort of were working from at the time. I mean, I think that, the sort of context of the Soviet Union and the emergence of communism and sort of emergent theories of totalitarianism are really critical, right? I think all of these people were, sort of looking to, socialist movements, across, Western Europe that has sort of been seen as kind of being anti-Christian. We're looking to the Soviet Union, which was actively engaged in a campaign of shuttering churches and repressing religion, which were sort of associated with the old, bourgeois regime and so forth. And so this sort of theory emerges, right, that Christianity is necessarily kind of incompatible with totalitarian governments that make this kind of totalizing
Right.
claim on human life, right? And that they, therefore can't be, compatible with forces like Christianity that sort of call people ultimately to loyalty to a higher power and not simply the state. And I think then these kind of, within the writings of the international missionary movement and ecumenical movement, these sort of theories of totalitarianism, right, are being applied to Nazism. And this is also done like on the Catholic side, there's a papal encyclical called With Burning Concern, which is issued by Pope Pius XI in 1937, which criticizes, Nazism as a totalitarian regime and sort of draws directly on this analogy to the Soviet Union, which was also seen as a totalitarian regime, right? So there's this sort of assumption that sort of Christianity and totalitarianism sort of can't go together. The Nazism sort of fits under this kind of broad category under which the Soviet Union was being grouped. I think underlying all of that, right, is, it is in kind of lack of understanding, whether deliberately or not, of the Nazi attack on German Jews. I think that the real sort of consciousness around the deeply rooted legacies of anti-Judaism within the Christian churches is really something that emerges from the 1960s onward, a little bit earlier in the post World War II period. But I think, the sort of pastors in the international ecumenical movement are really still operating in a world that is not really sensitized to the Nazi attack on German Jews and is much more comfortable kind of talking about the Nazi attack on Christianity, right? And to be sure, there are ways that,
Interesting.
that the Nazis do try to prevent pastors from offering religious instruction. Right? So it's not that there aren't conflicts between Nazism and the churches, right? But Christians are not being sort of threatened in the same way that the Jews are. And that's something that I think the sort of international Christian leaders had difficulty seeing, not necessarily because of active deception, but because of kind of the frameworks within which they were operating.
And they were keeping that hidden, correct? The Nazi government wasn't, not maybe, but they were trying to keep it hidden internationally from the way they're treating Jews, correct?
To some extent, though, there were Jewish organizations in the United States that were sort of actively promoting boycotts of Germany.
So it's kind of a head in the sand kind of thing. So, okay, so let me think about it. So we have a Barmen Declaration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which you touch on and spend some time on. How does that affect our sense of the myth of resistance? Is that not resistance? Was it not good enough? Was it not representative enough? But how does the Barmen Declaration, maybe you can describe it just briefly, and then how does that factor into this logic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Barmen Declaration was produced by a meeting of, I think, before both pastors and lay people. It was written by the Reformed theologian Karl Barth, who I mentioned sort of earlier, who gets famous for this kind of existential theology he develops after the First World War. And the Barmen Declaration operates precisely within this narrative around totalitarianism, right? So it says that Christians cannot give their highest loyalty to a totalitarian state because Christians are ultimately loyal to Jesus. And this becomes the founding document of the so-called Confessing Church, which is an organization that's kind of critical of the Nazi attempts to kind of infiltrate and take over the churches and insert its own ideology. I think, the key piece of the Barmen Declaration, though, that we sometimes forget is that it's less, an anti-Nazi statement per se, and more a statement of, right, the church and the state sort of each have their own separate sphere, right? So they also talk about the role of the state in sort of promoting a political order and, the state sort of having its own sphere and simply the state kind of keeping out of the sphere of the church and sort of recognizing that Christians owe their ultimate loyalty to Jesus. So, in the context of the Nazi regime, yes, this does put these pastors kind of on notice, right? And there are a number of pastors of the Confessing Church who are surveilled by the Gestapo, who were even put in concentration camps. A small number like Martin Niemöller sort of spend the war in concentration camps due to their more sort of outspoken criticisms of Nazi church policy. So it's not that there aren't elements of resistance, but we also have to look at then what the Barmen Declaration doesn't say, right? It certainly doesn't have anything to say about the Nazis' attacks on German Jews. It doesn't
Hmm.
have anything to say about, sort of racism and Nazi racial policy. It doesn't
Hmm.
have anything to say about, sort of militarism and the move toward, German rearmament, which the churches are not, critical of it. As I mentioned, right, people who had been part of this confessing church movement also go on to serve as military chaplains during the war. What it was largely aimed at was this group called the German Christians, who were a kind of rival faction that wanted to kind of bring Nazi ideology directly into the church, right? So it's very much a critique of, yes, we have to keep, Nazism and political ideology out of the church, but is that a critique of sort of Nazi racism per se? There were some more radical figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think we mentioned last time, who sort of want to push in a more radical direction toward a kind of critique of racism and Nazi ideology per se, not just Nazi infiltration into the churches, right? But for others, that's not a sort of further move that they want to make. And then after the war, right, of course, then the Barmen Declaration, becomes part of this narrative of, look, this was a kind of central document of resisting, against the Nazi regime, right? And in some ways it was, and in other ways it's a more, complicated stories I'm trying to show.
I mean, I love the mixture of complicated and straightforward because that's life, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
every single time I think about a historical moment, I'm like, I'll get some like brief definition of it, right? Not like, of course, like what you just gave in the Barmen Declaration. That is a great explanation of it for the purposes of our conversation, right? And yet there's so much about it in the sense of like, we probably, we could read the Barmen Declaration. We could look at its logic. We could look at the authors. We could look at their life and their influence and what happened to them, right? And things become more complicated. That's my point, right?
Hmm.
But when describing and writing anything down in history, right, we are by necessity, what? Shaping something. So we're going to leave some stuff out. We're going to
Hmm.
put some stuff in, right? That's history because we're trying to make sense of it and we're trying to bring that data that helps us make sense of it. But there's always data that's outside of it. And there's always data that we have to work with. And I don't know if you want to speak on that anyway. I was just thinking about that. History is complicated. I was building off your statement that it's a very complicated picture, right? When we're going back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. This sort of takes us a little bit outside our conversation about, Protestants and more toward, kind of historical theory and so forth.
Yes.
In my, in the discipline of history in the sort of 1970s, 1980s, this sort of, wave of kind of postmodernism, swept through the
Yes.
humanities, right? The idea of, can we be, sort of certain about the foundations of knowledge or things, simply kind of
Yes.
constructs and language and discourse. And there were these real debates within the historical discipline, like how much can we really, know about history through the evidence, or is history simply a kind of narrative that doesn't have much of a different sort of epistemological status from a fictional narrative? And when I first came to graduate school, right, I was sort of, somewhat suspicious of those kind of postmodern critiques of kind of historical knowledge and the historical discipline. But having sort of gone through and written this book myself, I kind of see where they're coming from, right? Because I'm
Right.
aware as an author, of course, you have to make decisions. You have to figure out, how you're going to shape the narrative, how you're
You
going to make
cannot
sense.
include
You
everything.
cannot include everything, and you're also, framing the evidence, in certain ways. And there are kind of narrative, constructs, right? If we think about, comedy or irony or tragedy, right? These sort of basic narrative constructs that we know through literature, these are also by necessity sort of employed by nonfiction authors as well as a way of making narratives that make sense to readers. And my story, as we've sort of talked about, right, to some extent is in the ironic mode, right? You had sort of people, let's say it's sort of the international Christian leaders kind of claiming one thing through a kind of, more limited framework that they had in their minds. But me
Yes.
sort of coming in later as the historian, sort of with the benefit of hindsight, I can show you, well, this is how they were constructing reality
Yes.
in their minds.
Yes.
But here's a kind of another framing that we can use to come to a critical perspective, right? That's a kind of ironic mode, which is a narrative device that I am imposing as a historian, right? And all of his, whether we're writing with sort of a comic mode or, tragic, but all by necessity, nonfiction
Absolutely.
writers have to do this. So I think that that's, a basic, an important point for people to recognize. It doesn't mean that history is simply fictionalized. I mean, all of this
No.
is sort of rooted in evidence and in fact, but then there's the framing that we bring to it to make sense of it. And I think that's what makes history interesting, but also what makes it a continual source of debate, right? Because we can have the same set of facts, but interpret them through different narrative frames. And I
Yes.
think that that's really important. If this is interesting for your listeners, right? This is kind of how our discipline works, I would say, in a broader level. I'm sort of opened up how I do my work a little bit.
Well, I love that because methodology is so important to me because someone can tell me anything, but my question is, well, how did you come to that conclusion?
Right.
Right? It's that whole idea is a clock is right twice a day, right? So someone can look at the clock and their justification is that clock is right. And yet if they did it a minute later, the justification would be wrong because a broken clock is right twice a day. It's a kind of maybe it's a confusing metaphor, but the idea is like we don't have total control and our methods matter and the way that we work through the data matter and we make inferences matter. And,
Mhm.
for me, I'm so funny because I've been thinking about this recently. Like, what would I explain to someone about how I view history? And like, so I'm a Christian, so I definitely have a Christian worldview about God creating, about Jesus as a part, right? That my theological that informs my ontology, but I'm in my metaphysics, but I'm a critical realist, and from what I understand that to be, right, it's that one, I interpret things. So it's like Gadamer. I'm not sure how much you know Gadamer, right? But that
Sure.
idea of
Yeah.
the hermeneutics and horizons, like I'm definitely buy into that. Like we have our horizon and we try to mix horizons together with new horizons. And so I get it that I interpret everything and I'm very comfortable with that. But I'm also a critical realist with the sense that I don't therefore make that assumption that nothing can be known, that truth is a construct, and that the past is inaccessible. I don't agree with
Mhm.
that. I think that we only have the present, and then I think we have the information that helps us build inferences about the past, and everyone is constrained by that. Every single
Mhm.
person right now in the world, they live in a world with the same amount of data as everyone else. Now, their access to that data, their ability to understand and interpret that data, their skills and getting that's all different, right? That's not the claim I'm making. The claim I'm making is that all the bones of the dinosaurs are still in the ground, right? The documents from Nazi Germany and the Barmen Declaration, right? How do we get, well, any of us can go read that. And what are we getting? We're getting information that then we have to connect to other information because no one that wrote the Barmen Declaration is still alive, correct?
Mhm.
They're all dead. We can't talk to them about what they thought. We can't go to that person. So what do we have? Well, we have records. We have information. And so we do the best we can with that information. I don't want to get us too off track. I know like time is getting, becoming of the essence, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that approach. What do you think about that approach? Do you think that's a good approach? How would you assess that?
No, I think that, I would agree. I mean, that it's a matter of sort of balancing this understanding of, even nonfiction writing as a literary construction and something that relies on the frames that we bring to it and this idea of hermeneutics that's coming out of Gadamer on the one hand, with a fealty to historical evidence and rooting our interpretations in the
Yes.
strongest evidence that we can. I mean, the question of kind of historians' reliance on written records is something that's also creates challenges for us, right? We have to
Yes.
remember, well, what was created and what was destroyed and who is organizing those records. If I go to the, Protestant Church archive and I'm looking through files, well, how will those files, those files were organized by a person with a certain purpose in a certain system and
Yes.
so forth. And a lot of the, I mean, there were archives create like so Martin Niemöller, who I mentioned, I mean, his brother created an archive of the Confessing Church in 1947 that really became the kind of basis for a lot of historical writing about this period that kind of centered the church's resistance against Nazism and knowledge of other factions that had a more sort of compliant relationship with the Nazi regime or were even sort of pro-Nazi. A lot of those records, even getting access to them by sort of independent-minded critical scholars, was a challenge and sometimes didn't happen until, the 90s or even
Right.
later. So we have this idea of historical records, but how are those produced? How are they organized and who can access them? I think is something that is not obvious, right? They don't simply kind of exist in nature and they're not equally accessible to everybody. So even the idea of like the historical facts and where they're coming from, I think has to be questioned critically.
Absolutely. And I am all for the critical evaluation of historical sources, not only, I mean, at any time at the beginning of the Christian, not era, that's not what I mean, but the beginnings of Christianity, right? The Gospels, things like that. These are historical documents that had to be treated as such. Now, we ascribe, Christians, me as a Christian, ascribe more meaning to that and significance and spiritual significance to those writings, including the writings of the Hebrew Bible and scriptures. Nevertheless, they are written documents that are historical documents open to historical investigation and critical analysis. And I think that Christians, we get messed up about that. We get messed up about that because of our views of inerrancy, our views of the Bible. They make it almost like this untouchable thing, almost in a little bit like the Quran in Muslim theology, where you can't touch it, and yet it's not like that. It's never been like that. People have always kind of wrestled with these scriptures. And I just think that's important. You're thinking about, there is something attention I want to bring out, make sure we bring out before our show ends. And this is the idea of human rights language within the post-war German church and the tension with these human rights and then the continuity of some Nazi ideology or whatever, those traces of Nazism that remained in Germany and in the German church. Obviously, that creates a tension there with human rights language. What's going on with that, and what's the significance of human rights language in the German church?
Yeah, so what I argue is that human rights language functions as a kind of bridge between the older, a kind of nationalist worldview that the church had embraced sort of through World War II, and then a new sort of reorientation toward post-war internationalism. So human rights, I think, it's a language that presents itself as universal, right? It's not just about the human rights of Germans, but kind of the human rights of everybody. So by embracing a human rights language and positioning the church as a kind of spokesperson or sort of representative of human rights, German Protestants are able to integrate their church into the international ecumenical movement, into the World Council of Churches, claim that they have a kind of loyalty to the United Nations and new ideals of cooperation and reconciliation and so forth. At the same time, because they see sort of human rights, they position their human rights activism is a way of overcoming the kind of secularism that they saw as responsible for the war. Those human rights are equally applied to Germans who may have been members of the Nazi Party and now are being subjected to denazification measures, right? They argue, well, a true understanding of human rights means we have to kind of get beyond this sort of punitive justice where the Germans are being treated sort of unequally compared to the Allies, right? And look, the Allies also carried out, bombings of German cities and so forth, and they're
Yeah,
not, going on
Dresden.
trial, right? So the human rights of Germans are being treated
Yes.
unfairly, and that becomes a way of, I think, bridging still this kind of German, nationalism or, sort of continuities with some of the older ideology, the kind of refusal to look more critical, Nazism, the kind of, binary that's getting drawn between sort of punitive justice versus kind of Christian reconciliation, which can also have anti-Semitic connotations. That's being folded in with this new orientation toward internationalism, where we're not just fighting for, the human rights of us Germans, but rather of a new sort of world order that's built on the foundation of sort of respect of the human person rather than sort of devaluing them the way that totalitarian states had. So I think human rights discourse is really significant, but right, it's not, so simple as saying, we were responsible for the Holocaust and, therefore we embrace human rights, right? I think that narrative is getting debunked by historians. Really, the more critical attention to the Holocaust and Nazi crimes doesn't come until really a generation later.
Yeah, and thinking about even what happened in Germany and the Allies and their bombing of cities. And
Mhm.
really, the idea, the theory in air warfare that you would be able to bomb cities and bomb essentially countries into submission, which essentially didn't happen until essentially the atomic bomb. And then that essentially, I guess, would be an example of a aerial bombing actually bringing a country to its knees
Mhm.
to give up.
Mhm.
Otherwise, that hadn't happened. And the civilian casualties were absolutely massive as a result. And the Allies participated in as much bombing of those cities. And even thinking about that idea of Dresden and the firestorms that happened in that and different areas and cities in Japan as the Allied, wasn't there one American either colonel or something that was essentially like, or general that was like, if we lose this war, I'm going to be tried on war crimes,
Mhm.
because essentially dropping these napalm that would create these firestorms that would literally lift people off their feet and suck them into the center city inferno and just absolutely destroyed people by the thousands and obviously millions by the end of the war. And so I guess the only reason I'm bringing that up is like war is atrocious, right?
Mhm.
And people, they compromise morals on every side.
Mhm.
Women and children and babies and all were killed by Allied bullets and bombs. And I'm not saying that I don't know, I'm not making some ultimate claim about it. I'm just saying it's worth noting. And so this is the kind of last section but I think it's so important. And I don't want to do one-on-one. It's not a one-on-one comparison as like what's happening today. But I would love to get your ideas of some of that, looking at the mechanisms right now that you might see and perceive in our own culture in America or beyond around the world that you're aware of. When you look at the debates here in America about Christian nationalism in particular, what mechanisms from Germany do you see repeating, if any? Are there parallels in your mind? And if so, what are those parallels?
Certainly, I mean, I think one can, again, I think I think I mentioned this, the last time that sort of, the rhetorical strategy of, claiming that one's political opponents are, the second coming of the Nazis, I think is something that's been tried by,
We
many
love
political
doing that.
movements since 1930. It can be effective at kind of, rallying your own side, not necessarily effective in bridging some of the divides that I think
Right.
help, move societies forward beyond extremism. But I think certainly, ideas of Christian nationalist notions of sort of America, the founding of America is being kind of ordained by God, or being able to read American history in a way that sort of sees the hand of God kind of guiding the country in a certain direction, Christianity and so forth. I mean, I think some of those ideas certainly, were present in movements like the German Christians that had backed the Nazi regime, which, really saw, had a kind of theology of sort of God's hand in world history. And, the Germans is the new Israel, and the Germans is kind of, a biblically chosen people. I mean, this was a
Right.
theology that was especially prominent, during the First World War, as a way of Christian pastors trying to kind of rally support for the war with this kind of chosen people rhetoric. But it has roots earlier, even in kind of 19th century German Protestantism, going back to the era of the Napoleonic Wars, but gets, I think, taken to this really sinister direction, to say that Hitler, for all of his personal flaws and, whether or not he was a kind of conventional Christian, nevertheless was sort of, chosen by God in order to lead Germany toward, its true role as this sort of leading nation on the world stage. And I think so we have to be, I think, suspicious of movements that, ever want to draw this kind of direct parallel between sort of religion and political power, right? And claim that they alone can sort of see God's hand in the world, and, lo and behold, it's always pointing toward their side.
Right.
Right. I think that that's a kind of, a sort of obvious appeal that religion can have as a source of support for political movements, that one that we have to be skeptical of, because it can oftentimes lead to forms of religion that are exclusionary and hostile to outsiders, and perhaps at odds with some of the, other elements of the Christian message, that, love of the neighbor and the
Love of
outsider, and
neighbor.
and so
That's a
forth,
pretty
right? That
big
are
one. Love of enemies. That's another one.
right, that are not necessarily accompanied by the Christian nationalists. worldview. So certainly one can draw, some parallels there in terms of some of the underlying kind of reasoning that emerges.
Sure. And again, we're not saying that we're not saying someone's a Nazi today. That's kind of anachronistic, at least from a German Nazi of the 90s, I would say. But we're saying that we're humans and we share the same human drives, and those drives to justify ourselves by some kind of divine agenda are strong. And they're very legitimizing. That's why they're so strong.
Exactly.
And again, you're not a theologian, and so I'm not asking you as a theologian, but just as someone who's understood this and read a lot of theology, right? A very influential theology. I mean, you probably understand Protestant theology more than 99% of pastors do, and can probably articulate it, right? And I'm assuming you're not Christian. I mean, I don't need to get into your faith, but like you understand the theology.
I mean, I'm Jewish, as I think I mentioned.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes. So, so, we share the same Hebrew scriptures, and then, we have those additions, those pesky New Testament additions, but so thinking about churches trying to maintain morality and moral integrity in polarized politics, what lessons do we have to learn and glean from this, right? We have a democracy that was being built in Germany. Churches need to step in. They stepped in, and yet also kind of misrepresented and kind of had a myth-making past. And then this had repercussions all the way through in Germany and even to today. What's the lesson?
I mean, I think a big lesson is that it points to the danger of churches trying to expand their position and influence in society by aligning themselves with political power, I would say is a big thing. I think that we're, seeing the United States is also in a period of secularization. I think that for a variety of reasons, sort of organized Christianity has always had a stronger hold in the U.S. population than in Europe, going back to the period of industrialization in the 19th century. This largely has to do with our system of kind of free churches and churches being able to remain more independent. But certainly, the United States is also, in terms of levels of religious belief, regular participation in religious services, the role of religious institutions in daily life, the U.S. is also becoming more secular. And I think this story, of German and European history cautions religious leaders who try to reclaim their relevance by aligning themselves with political power and trying to sort of piggyback on the coercive power of the state in order to increase the prominence of their own organizations. I think some of your previous guests have talked about the sort of interesting, statistic that people who kind of identify themselves today as, Christian nationalists and have a very, kind of nationalistic interpretation of Jesus is the American Savior and so forth, are actually less likely to sort of go to church and kind of participate in more, traditional aspects of religious ritual, right? So I think there is a danger in because, ultimately political forces of whatever ideology are pursuing their own power, their own good, and not necessarily the goals of religion. So I think religious groups kind of align themselves with, the coercive forces of state power, oftentimes assuming that this will lead to a greater prominence, lead to kind of people coming back to the church or whatever religious organization, but can have morally corrosive effects that in the long run actually erode the authority of religion. And I think this is something you see in Germany, where from, the 60s onward, I mean, part of the movements toward church leaving were kind of growing awareness of the church's complicity during the Nazi regime. So I think churches, align themselves with sort of political power at their peril, and that's something that we can see from the history that I'm tracing out. And other religious organizations. So this isn't just Christian national,
Right.
Other religious groups too can be kind of susceptible, but this alignment of sort of religion and political authority can be very explosive.
Yes, I mean, there's always been religious nationalism at some level, and history always shows that, right, at some level. But that religious nationalism tends to create problems, especially for humanitarian kind of issues, I think. And I don't think personally, as a theologian, someone educated in that, I don't think that Jesus came to start a political movement. not in the sense that we think about that today, although I think his movement has political implications. I don't think the primary one being that our allegiance is not to any political movement. That's the primary thing that it does, is like, it erases all loyalties to any higher power than God. It's supposed to, right? Any higher than Jesus, from the Christian perspective, who is God and brought this teaching. And so when we're going beyond that, we're violating some pretty clear theological principles from the New Testament that say, hey, the church and the state are really supposed to be separate. Jesus didn't come and start an earthly kingdom. He actually makes that pretty explicit. But, it's amazing how people, they kind of forget that. But it's okay. So this is the last question. What are your main hopes as you're having people read the book? What are your main hopes that they're taking away from it?
Yeah, so I would reiterate in part what I said previously, the dangers of religious groups trying to align themselves with a political power, and also,
yes,
I think more directly
worth repeating.
Directly toward the German case, to be a little bit more critical of this idea that the churches had sort of inherently resisted the Nazis, sort of interpreting the entire history of Christianity under National Socialism through the lens of, a figure like Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Right.
I think can lead us to have a little bit more humility, perhaps, about the role of the church in sort of resisting totalitarian movements in the 20th century, and therefore be a little bit more kind of thoughtful about the role of sort of religious organizations in our own time. I mean, I think another point, that I'm trying to make more broadly in the book is this sort of, critical look at kind of post-war democracy and looking at some of its exclusionary aspects as well, part of which were sort of introduced by religious organizations, and seeing how, democracy is kind of not simply something that this sort of set of institutional features that was instituted in 1945 and was perfect, but rather a kind of ongoing project that constantly has to be remade. And maybe that's something that can give us a little bit of hope when we're seeing sort of challenges to democracy today. A reminder that it's not, simply one fixed thing, but rather a form of government and of sort of social life that's always in motion and always in progress, and that we have a responsibility for.
Yeah, I really appreciate those words. It makes me think of the idea that I think it was, happiness hypothesis, just thought of his name, Jonathan Haidt. I think I heard this from him, but I'm not sure if it's original from him. Essentially, that religion both binds and blinds. And I think that's one of the things that for all of us, it definitely is a binding force, no doubt. And yet it's also a blinding force. And it's a force that can make us treat people as less than if they don't share it. And we have to be very careful about that. How can people connect with you and get the book? Is there a preferred vendor? Kind of sell yourself right now? And then what's your next project?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is Reinventing Protestant Germany. It's available wherever you buy books. So it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and bookshop.com. Can also be purchased directly through the website of Harvard University Press. I am on X, formerly known as Twitter,
Nice.
at Brandon Bloch, and I also have a website, brandon-bloch.com. My new project has to do with Germans expellees, so Germans who were expelled from East Central Europe at the end of World War II. Another lesser known, I think, than the bombings, but another kind of act against the Germans that was perpetrated by the Allies, and looking at how these expellees got involved in post-war human rights politics. So certainly continuities with my earlier project as well, but this time sort of looking more in terms of the international stage and how post-war Germans tried to make claims about human rights around issues of forced migration on an international level.
That is absolutely amazing, especially, again, given the tension of the forced migrations of some 6 million Jews to concentration camps. It's just always putting those two things right in perspective, not to mention millions of other people that they consider dissidents. Well, thank you, Brandon. Man, this is I could keep going. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for jumping in and spend some time with me and our audience.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. To our audience, guys, thanks for joining. And remember, do all those things like subscribe, join the Patreon, join the Substack, check out. We're trying to get all sorts of things so that we can create a community of critical thinkers here looking at this world with wide eyes and also hope and love. And so we'll see you guys next time. Until I see you, take care. God bless.